hello everyone, and thank you for joining me again for a video where I'm discussing important issues with a good friend of mine today, Justin Ram. Dr. Justin Ram is an economist like myself from Trinidad and Tobago, but he works across the Caribbean. And this is not the first time I'm having Justin. We did a chat like this sometime during the early stages of COVID, if my memory serves me correct. And we're still here 5 years later trying to solve all the Caribbean's problems. And on the 3rd of May, Justin published a very powerful article. It's on his blog on Medium. And the title of that article was Comparative Advantage, Cheap Consumption, and Poor Development Outcomes in the Caribbean. It's a very, very interesting article, very powerful. I suggest you go and have a read. And when I read it, I felt compelled to have this discussion with Justin so that we can ventilate some of the issues as well as make it more accessible and available to a wider audience. So I really appreciate, Justin, that you found the time to join me to have this discussion today. Thank you and welcome.
Marla, thanks so much. I'm so pleased to be here with you today to discuss this paper. But I think even more importantly, I couldn't discuss this paper with anyone better because I think you, being a Caribbean economist, and not only a Caribbean economist, an economist who understands the dynamics of small island developing states, you are probably the best person I could discuss these issues that I have ventilated, as you correctly said, in this paper. So thank you so much for giving me the opportunity. I'm really looking forward to having this discussion.
Thank you, Justin. So, this will be the first of many discussions on this paper, I'm sure. Um, so, I want you to just pretend like I'm an 8 year old, even though you and I were well over that tender age. But like I'm an 8 year old, tell me in this article in simple terms what you've identified as a real problem as to why, as you put it in the title, we have these poor development outcomes, meaning we're not achieving the development, socioeconomic development targets we would like to achieve. Tell me what you identify as the critical problems.
Well, the critical problem, as I see it, Marla, is this sort of rush to measure development simply by consumption, by how much we can consume. And this is for me, and I have to admit that I'm part of that problem because being an economist, sort of wedded to that sort of theory of measuring development by consumption outcomes. But what happened is that, I left Trinidad in since 1998 and really only lived there for 2 years since then. But since then, I've lived in the UK and other countries, and of course, living in Barbados since 2013. But when I went back to Trinidad in September last year, because I'm working on a particular project there, so I'm back and forth between there and Barbados, it really struck me that what the type of development outcomes I have seen in Trinidad and Tobago since I left there as a young man in the mid 1990s. And what were those development outcomes? I can say for myself that there aren't really many meaningful jobs for a great number of people within that economy. And
Mm-hmm.
when I reflected, it was the same across the rest of the Caribbean. It is the
Yes.
same in Barbados, the same in Jamaica, same in perhaps Turks and Caicos, where I was living for a couple of years as well. And this really struck me as to what was really happening here. And when I thought about it, I thought, well, if we are focused on these types of development outcomes, which are mainly related to foreign exchange reserves. So when you think
And
about it,
earning foreign exchange. Mm-hmm.
exactly. So if your main focus is earning foreign exchange, but why are you doing that? Because you want to consume everything that the globe has to offer, rather than focusing on what your own country can produce.
Mm-hmm.
And so if you are importing, and let me just summarize where I see the real issue. If you are consuming and 70% of what you consume is consists of imports, then you are not really producing much at home. And when you don't produce much at home, you don't create meaningful employment for your people.
Yeah.
And what does that mean? It then translates into there's really not much incentive to provide good education for everyone, because if you do that, there aren't really good jobs. So I was looking at that as a sort of a supply and demand sort of issue. If you don't have good jobs for everyone, well, why do you need to educate everyone well? Why do you need to provide
Yeah.
good health care for everyone? And so I saw this as serious feedback loops and a real challenge with the current development model that we have followed over the last 30 years. And so I decided to write this paper to say, you know what, we need a fundamental shift.
Absolutely.
If we want to change the outcomes, then it cannot be that we're simply trying to tinker within a current economic model. There needs to be a real massive change, and it has to be the economic model that needs to change rather than trying to tinker and to try to improve competitiveness. And it just hasn't worked for us. And so that's why I wrote this paper, because I just think the outcomes have not been good for the majority of our people.
Yeah.
Some people have of course done well, but the majority of our people have not done well, and the development outcomes have been poor for them.
Absolutely. And I think when you look at other metrics of development or lack thereof, such as poverty, inequality, they're all trending in the wrong direction. Of course, COVID didn't help. Most countries are not even measuring poverty. When was the last time Trinidad and Tobago measured poverty? Um, it was I think somewhere around 2014 or so. But anyhow, generally in the Caribbean, the Dominican Republic and Jamaica are the only two that measure poverty on a consistent basis. And so, if you're not measuring it, then how do you even know that the policies that you're implementing are yielding the development results that you would like to see in terms of your population? I mean, and that's the whole reason we elect a government for them to improve the quality of life for the majority of people in a country. And I think most people don't, there's a disconnect in terms of what we think of as why we elect government. But I think also we have to recognize that the development models that, for example, that you and I would have been taught in school, these are development models that have been handed down from, say, the global north mostly. We do have some development economists in the global south, but they are not the mainstream in the development discourse, right? And so we basically took models from people who have no relevant experience in small island developing states and the development trajectories of small island developing states. So therein lies the problem. We were following the wrong model. And I think that you're right. We can see the results of that. It is evident that we've been following the wrong model. So tell me what you think are the solutions to this problem we find ourselves in.
Yeah, well, the first solution I think has to be a rejection of the current economic model. And what do I mean by a rejection of that? I am saying that it is time for us to reject the theology, as I like to call it, of comparative advantage, right?
Hmm.
Uh,
Hmm.
Comparative advantage, and we have all learned that. We've been taught that this is really good at, and mathematically it makes a lot of sense,
Yeah.
but developmentally it makes no sense for our people, because when you think about it, what is comparative advantage? Comparative advantage says that we trade openly, and
Hmm.
I'm all for open trade, but it means that you should only produce what you have a sort of a competitive advantage in doing.
Yeah.
Now, Marla, we are from very small places.
Yeah.
There is no way that we can ever really compete against really advanced economies, or even places in Asia that have much larger populations and economies.
Populations. Yeah.
Well,
Hmm. Hmm.
and I'm saying that it does not make sense to follow a model whereby you are really discriminating against your people in your own labor market, because ultimately, at the end of the day, Trinidadians and Tobagonians, Barbadians and Jamaicans, people who live in Belize. For the majority of those people, the only legal labor market that they can operate in is the one at home.
Yeah.
And so when you say to them, first of all, okay, here's your labor market, you need to operate. But then at the same time, we're allowing via comparative advantage to import a lot of cheap imports, then you are significantly disadvantaging them. Now, I am not saying that I'm not advocating for banning imports or anything like that. But I'm saying that there needs to be a development model that seeks to produce more at home. And that either is 100% value added at home, or even if it's 50% value added on imports, that there needs to be some value added at home. Because ultimately, Marla, as you know, your marginal productive labor, which is ultimately your wage rate, is really a reflection of how productive your people are.
Yeah.
And if we have confined our the majority of our population to be the distributor of imports or to be the maintainers of imports, like say for air conditions, if you bring in an air condition, then you are maintaining it, you're not producing it.
Hmm.
If you have confined your people to those roles, there's not really a lot of value added. And so those jobs don't pay well, and therefore by extension many of these people aren't able to take care of themselves and their households. And then what's the feedback loop in that, Marla, is that you then get a situation where governments must now subsidize households. And when you
Yeah.
think about it, 50% of our budgets are spent on transfers and subsidies,
Yep.
really subsidizing households because those households can't find good jobs. And therefore, that leads to this level of fiscal deficits and high debt levels that we have in our countries. And so I think this is where I'm trying to push the argument that there needs to be a fundamental change,
Yes.
because there's no amount of structural adjustment programs that can fix this. Because if you think about it, we go to the fund and the World Bank and we tinker at the margins, and we might correct things and improve things for 10 years, and then our economies are back there because the fundamental challenge has not been identified and dealt with. We are really only tinkering at the margins. And I think I am hoping that with this paper and hopefully with the discussion that we can begin to change mindsets and change at least some of the thinking around what type of development we want for our people. And I think for me, Marla, the most important thing that I've seen that really bothers me is that when people cannot work and take care of their families, there's something called dignity inequality.
Yeah.
And speak about wealth and income. If I don't have dignity, that then leads to terrible social outcomes and
Yeah.
really antisocial behavior as well. And for me, I think it's time for us to focus on these things and to change the economic paradigm so that we ensure our people have that dignity to walk hand in hand with everyone in society.
Absolutely. I mean, I couldn't have said it better that inequality and dignity, we really do have people who work jobs, two jobs sometimes, and are still, unable to mind their family, as we say in Trinidad. And one of the reasons that this article that you wrote resonated so strongly with me on early May was I had just come back from spending a month in the Pacific in Vanuatu. Vanuatu is a country that consists of 83 islands. It really should be many countries, but former colonizers lumped them all. It's like if you take the whole Eastern Caribbean from Tobago all the way up to maybe even as far as Puerto Rico, and you tell all of them you're one country, kind of thing.
Right.
That's what Vanuatu is. Different islands have different languages, different cultures, and so on. Anyway, Vanuatu is the most vulnerable country to natural disasters on Earth.
Mhm.
It is, I mean, there was an earthquake while I was there, but there was a really bad one in December, and it destroyed a lot. Half of the capital was affected.
Mhm.
Um, and so they're the most vulnerable to natural disasters. Their GDP per capita resembles that of Haiti. So
Right.
low GDP per capita, but that is by no means an accurate reflection of the quality of life. This is the country that consistently tops the Happy Planet Index. And why is that? because what I recognize, one of the fundamental differences between the Pacific Islanders and us in the Caribbean is that they have very large, entrenched indigenous populations, people who have been there for 3,000 years. There is this thing called land tenure, and we talk about property rights as a big part of why we are underdeveloped. That's not a problem there because basically everybody comes from some ancestral village, and you can always go back to that ancestral village even if you have gone away and migrated and come back. You can always go back to your ancestral village and claim a spot, and you could build your house and live. And I feel like these kinds of things are fundamental to why they have a very strong focus on well-being, very strong focus on community, and it's intrinsic. It's sort of inherent in them. It's not something new. Like the whole idea of community is sort of popular now, and they have a very long-standing culture of conservation and sustainability that predates any climate crisis.
Yes.
And that's one of the things we miss in the Caribbean. We lack. We don't have, apart from Dominica and maybe Guyana, Suriname, we really don't have much of an indigenous population. Um, and we are a transient people, you know, based on our colonial history. And I think that when you look at I don't even want to call it development model because it's not a development model for them. This is just how they live, right? They
Yes.
eat what they grow what they eat. They emphasize domestic production, they emphasize well-being, they emphasize community, they emphasize resilience through that community, looking after each other. um, I mean, even though their GDP per capita is low, I couldn't tell you that I saw anybody who was poor and hungry and suffering, and that dignity inequality you mentioned. That's I love that term. There was none of that, you
Hmm.
know. And I feel like, when I was there, they were saying things like, it'd be so good to collaborate and understand the journey that you guys in the Caribbean are on as it relates to your development journey and how we can learn from you. I'm like, I think we could learn more from you guys than you can learn from us, because and to your point, as I was saying to them, we did it all wrong. And then you wrote this article just a week after and said, we did it all wrong. And so I completely agree with you that we need a real rethink, of our development strategies and models. um, that's going to take a long time, first of all, to accept and to acknowledge that we were wrong. And how do you then pivot to a new development strategy? And I feel like maybe we need to tackle different elements of it, over time, as opposed to trying to boil the ocean. One that I think is a glaring example, and we talked so much about it during COVID. Now we're talking about it in the light of tariff wars. We need to emphasize domestic agriculture across the Caribbean. And we talk about it all the time. We talk about higher local content in the tourism product. We've been talking about this since I started university in the 1990s, and we're still talking about it now. So I'm just saying to you, I feel like there has to be a way for us to make this change, and make it effectively in maybe a phased manner. I don't know what the answer is, but I feel like we need to probably come up with like a roadmap,
Yeah.
to make it doable and implementable.
Yes. And I'm so happy to hear how those folks in Pacific are actually living, and I feel like sometimes I yearn for that. And I feel like when I was a boy growing up in Trinidad, we were
That's how it
there.
was. Yeah, yeah,
That's
yeah.
how
That's
it
how it
was.
was in the
That's how it was.
1970s, 80s. That's how it was, Justin.
That's how it was. And
Yeah.
so I think to that point, Marla, I think it is doable because if you think about it, it is really since the 1980s that we took a significant shift in how we wanted to develop and what became important to us. And
Yeah.
so it's been 30 to 40 years. And I think it's probably going to take another 30 to 40 years to shift in the real direction that we want to go to. But I also want to say this, Marla. You know, last week I attended the Caribbean Film Festival in Trinidad.
Mm-hmm.
And what it brought home to me was because I attended a few of the panel discussions, and what it brought home to me is that even in this current model that we're in, it means that no one is telling the stories of that young woman or that young man in Trinidad and Barbados and what it is for them, what do they experience? Because I think part of the issue that we have here is that nobody is really doing the storytelling and doing the short films of what our people are experiencing. And let me explain why I think that's important. Because what tends to happen is that we hear, okay, somebody may not be doing well or communities are not doing well, but we really don't know the stories of those people.
Mm-hmm.
And then what happens is that we try to import policies, as you know, from North America,
From
from
those
Europe,
without relevant experience.
based on their storytelling.
Mm-hmm.
And what we need is more of our own. And this comes back again to the whole issue of local production, because
Mm-hmm.
this is important. Because even the producing short films of our own stories is about local production and telling who we are, and then formulating policies from there would be very, very useful for us. And
Mm-hmm.
so for me, I'm totally in agreement. There needs to be an implementation plan around this. I've tried to discuss some of the issues that I think we need to deal with.
Mm-hmm.
Part of it, I think the number one area we need to deal with is our governance model. Um, and that I'm now in the process of writing a little paper around that. But I think that what we call democracy is no longer democracy, and and that has to change. And so
Every time I say that, Justin, people say, "Oh, so you're a communist," but but
no,
no, you're absolutely right. You're absolutely right, and it's been broken for a long time, and it's not just broken in the Caribbean. But anyway, sorry, I didn't mean to just to interrupt.
yeah, no, and it's and so I think the time has come for us to also have that conversation on when I go out to vote, what am I really voting for? And I think and Marla, I'm gonna say this to you here. I think political parties are a real big problem that we have because they've sort of hijacked our democracies. And I think the change has to be about getting people to vote on the development outcomes that they want.
Mm-hmm.
So instead of voting for people, you vote on a plan, as it were. This
Or
is
an
how I want
issue.
to vote
Mm-hmm.
on an issue.
Mm-hmm.
And then I vote individually for candidates who represent my area. Not I'm not voting for political parties. Candidates who represent my area, who who are selling their ideas as to how they will help me and my constituency achieve the development goals that I've voted for, right? And so I think that is, and I'm just putting this out there. I mean, the paper I'm trying to write, I'll publish that in a few months. But I think that has to be an area that we discuss because oftentimes in our democracy, we are voting. We're just voting. We're not
Yeah.
really voting for any development outcomes, and then we're very unhappy when things go wrong. And I think that is a fundamental area that does have to change if we are going to make this leap into this new future that I think we definitely need to start discussing and hopefully implementing.
One of the things that I feel has worked in the Caribbean in the recent, let's say past 10, 15 years, that I talk about a lot and I would like to see us use more broadly in the Caribbean. And as a matter of fact, the Cayman Islands had announced a few months ago that they're going to do this. But I'm sure you remember the EPOC in Jamaica and this EPOC committee, Economic Program Oversight Committee, that basically took what you're suggesting, what is the development agenda, or at the time, policy agenda of the government, and then holds the government to account publicly on a quarterly basis. This committee, who is made up of independent from the government, made up of people who are for example, from civil society, from academia, from the development banks, and basically quarterly the chairman, who is Keith Duncan, well, was, they recently reformed this committee, but he would go quarterly on the corner by the rum shop literally and say, the government said they were going to bring inflation down to this. They said they were going to do this to the exchange rate, blah, 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 and achieve this level of growth. And here's what they actually did. And here's what they didn't achieve. And here's what they're going to do differently. And I feel like that kind of marries what you're talking about in terms of we need a different governance approach, but also along with the implementation that I mentioned earlier, that yes, we want to make all of this change, but we have to make it, you can't eat an elephant in one bite. You have to eat it one bite at a time.
Yeah.
So, breaks it down into implementable goals. And then you have this committee that holds the government to account on a quarterly basis publicly and tells those stories about how has that implementation gone, like was it successful, was it not, and how are we then therefore going to change the approach. And we saw the changes that this has made in Jamaica in the past 10, 12 years since they defaulted in 2011 or 2012.
Yeah.
And I feel like that could be a real powerful tool. And it's not rocket science. It's not expensive to implement this committee, and it
Yes.
has worked so well in Jamaica. And I feel like this is something that could really make a difference in our country, in Trinidad and Tobago, and in any country. Um, and I think fundamental to any governance model has to be accountability.
Hmm.
And that's what's really missing. Nobody's held to account. I mean, even when governments do foolishness like don't let the auditor general do her work, who's ever held to account for that? It's insane that governments get away with doing foolishness, and there's some uproar in the newspaper, and people make noise on social media, and 10 days later everybody forgets about it. But if you have this committee, then it lives, right? And the accountability lives. And that's one thing that I feel, we need to think about implementing this epoch type structure, um, to drive implementation of the results that we want to see in the Caribbean.
Yeah, I agree, and so if I can add to that, I think, and what I'm suggesting here as well is that the accountability will come from if you know what you voted for, right?
Yeah.
And so many times people go to the polls and, well, I just voted for my party, and well, whatever they do, well, they know best. What I'm saying to our people is that no, you need to vote for the type of development that you want. And because you know that you voted for that, and if you feel that isn't happening, then you can hold your representatives accountable for that. And what did I mean? And I just want to touch on this
Mm-hmm.
because I'm looking at the time as well for us. Now, what I think is the development outcomes that we want, and here's what I think we need to move away from this constant need to have excess foreign exchange reserves. We do need foreign exchange reserves, but that cannot be what we focus on. And I also think that our development outcome has to be focused on the human condition. And when I say human condition in the paper, I've tried to explain that by saying that we want to maximize the ability of an individual to earn a good income throughout their working life, right? What does that then translate to? It means that as that individual is brought into this country, so from conception and birth, and so I'm talking about from conception now, we have an obligation to ensure that that baby is well taken care of, is well educated, has good health care, so that that person can have maximum opportunity to make a substantial contribution to society. And then when they reach the working age, here's why we need all this local production, because we want them to be able to earn a good income, to produce something, to earn a good marginal productive labor, which is their wage rate. And that can only happen if we prioritize the local domestic market for things that we can produce at home so that we can consume those things. Not saying that we can produce everything by all means,
Yeah.
but when you think about it in that way, focusing on the human condition rather than focusing on only on government deficits and foreign exchange reserves, which
Yeah.
are important, yes, But the oversized focus on that has meant that we have forgotten all about the human condition, and we need to now refocus our development model on that. And
Yeah.
so, if you now have a governance system that is focused on those things, then I think hopefully you will have a different level of accountability. You can then have a committee like the EPOC in Jamaica also helping you monitor your pathway towards achieving these goals. So I think those are the type of things that are really going to be critical for us as we move forward. Now, Marla, I know this conversation is not going to be easy across to take it a very colleagues at UE, and they say, "Well, Justin, we're rejecting your thesis." Yeah, I say, "Well, I'm going to come to you and debate it." But I know it's going to be difficult to try
When
to.
is that happening? When is that debate
Well,
happening?
they have told me in September in the new academic year, so
Okay, okay. We look out for it.
yes, and
Mm-hmm.
what I would love to do, as I'm saying this publicly here, I want to invite you and some other notable economists to come along, and let's just speak about it and say, we want a different outcome.
Yeah.
Time to have that change, as it were. And you know what? If I'm wrong at the end of the day, okay, I'm wrong, and I will go with it. So, but something tells me that I'm not wrong, that we need to make that change and we need to have that debate, because ultimately I think at the University of the West Indies, where we train a lot of our policymakers,
Mm-hmm.
has to be a sort of a cradle, as it were, for changing the mindset, as well. Yes.
Absolutely. And I think part of it is, I mean, you're right. The human condition is, of course, the ultimate goal, right? To make sure, like I said, why do we elect governments? To make our lives better. It depends on what you're measuring. If we're measuring GDP, then we're not going to measure the human condition and we're not measuring poverty. When you look at, for example, the gross national happiness index, and I know a lot of people say, oh, that's how do you measure? Just look at the index. The title of the index is probably, maybe it's misbranded, but it really measures things like governance, freedoms, accountability. When you look at, for example, Amartya Sen's idea of development as freedom, meaning the human condition, I think fundamentally we need a shift from measuring GDP as an outcome that we want to aspire to. It absolutely shouldn't be. And so maybe we also need, in all of the mix of the things that we need to change what are we measuring, you know? And that gross national happiness, I think when you look at the eight, I think it's 8 or 9 main elements of that index. If we achieve those things, and the only country that measures it on it is Bhutan,
Yes.
and they themselves are not doing extremely well on the index, but it's aspirational. It's one of those indices where if you're measuring it, you can see whether you're moving forward or you're falling behind as it relates to the human condition and the freedoms of people. So yeah, I think I look forward to having that debate, and I look forward to maybe what we need to do is, when we have that debate, is to think about how do we operationalize the change,
Yes.
because I find many times, and we often get criticized with, and justifiably so, Justin, that too many times as economists, we blah blah blah, we talk, and then what happens? There's a big conference, and we everybody talks, and then there's no meaningful action. I feel like we need to always bear in mind everything that we are trying to do. We talk about what we want to change, and we talk about how we're going to change it.
Yes.
I think
Yes.
that's just as important. So this is the first of many conversations on this issue then.
Yes. And let me just touch on something you said there.
Yes.
When I was a master's student, well, doing my PhD actually. So I mean, so still a lot of years ago.
Yeah.
One of my colleagues actually focused on his thesis was on happiness and the environment, and
Mhm.
and he did analysis to show, well, if you are in a good environment, and meaning, if you have parks to walk in, or you can go on hikes, and the environment is in a
Be
good
in nature.
nature,
Hmm.
found that people's happiness improved. And so and really he was touching on this notion of how important it was for us to measure happiness with respect to policy making. And when it comes to touching on the whole idea of what we measure, a colleague of mine at the World Bank last year sort of messaged me, said, Justin, let's look at a country like Zambia in Africa. He says a country full of, they have millions of people, they have bountiful amounts of natural resources. Is that really a poor country? And I said, by all means not, but we classify that country as a poor country because of how we measure
GDP
it,
per capita, yeah.
per capita.
Hmm.
And
Hmm.
that GDP per capita sort of keeps a country like Zambia poor because for them to develop, they must now be dependent on foreign investment.
They must increase GDP.
It's GDP. And so when you think about it, you're like, well, no, this can't be the way to develop because many countries will simply never be able to develop in the way that we think is right. While at the
Hmm.
same time, many of the people living there might be very, very happy, as you said in Vanuatu. And so I just think now is the time we have to think about it, and it's everyone in society has to think about this clearly because what I did identify in the paper as well, Marla, is that when you start talking about change, there will always be losers. All right,
Yeah.
uh, and the losers
Vested interests and will,
vested
yeah.
interest
Hmm.
exactly. And so as we strategize about how to make the change and how to implement if I can tell you how it cannot be done, I'm telling you why it cannot be done. And that is an important strategy to use to help you implement things because those vested interests are really important. We need to bring everyone on board and say, look, we want a society and economy that benefits everyone, not just a few that we've become accustomed to.
Yeah.
Everyone needs to be has to benefit from this. If we want the type of social outcomes and we want to get rid of the antisocial behavior that we might see, particularly like crime in some of our countries, Trinidad and Tobago in particular, we need to have that debate and speak about what we all want as citizens and residents of these countries for all of our citizens, not just a few.
Indeed, it has to be broad based. So I think, Justin, we've kicked off maybe the first of many discussions on this, and hopefully, you and I will be part of a change process for our country. If it's gonna take 30 to 40 years, I tell you, I'm not gonna be around. I don't intend on sticking around that long. But at least the next generation, I would want my children, I don't know how you feel, but I would want my children to feel like they could come back home to their country after they're finished with school and so on. But the way Trinidad is right now, I don't know if that's a reality, and so we have to make our home one that we all want to be there you know
Yes, yes. And just let me say, I am spending a lot more time in Trinidad recently, working on a venture, as you know, there, trying to build it into a viable business. It's a carnival mass band, but it has turned into a manufacturing and production. And what I've noticed, Marla,
Hmm.
that it's more difficult for me as an entrepreneur to want to produce in Trinidad than it is to import everything. To,
Mm.
to import is easy, but to produce there is difficult. And if I need to jump through a whole set of hoops if to get concessions to be able to produce locally. But if I want to import, I just have to click and it comes in.
Once you have the foreign exchange, you
Yeah,
could
the
just.
foreign exchange,
Hmm.
exactly.
Hmm.
So it's sort of all of these things that we need to change the mindset on. And just to say that what we are doing now, we are trying, you and I here, we may not see the changes in our lifetime, but like even the whole idea of the Mongolian Empire, that started with the thought of one person, right? And eventually that then grew from there. How China became to be, with the amalgamation of different territories. It really began with the thought of one or few people. And it didn't happen in their lifetime. It probably happened after. And I think that's what we have to focus on. Let's sort of plant the seed and hopefully we can get others to help water that seed, and it becomes something even after we may no longer be around to see the final outcome.
Definitely. I'm with you. So we're going to try our best, right? That's all you can really do. Try your
Yes,
best every day.
exactly,
All
exactly.
right.
Yes.
Thank you so much, Justin, for your time, for writing this article, and for spending your time and just, telling us what's inside your heart. I really appreciate it.
Okay. Thank you so much,
Mhm.
Marla. Thank you for having me.
All right.
Okay.
Onward and upward. We'll keep pressing.
Yes. Thank
All
you.
right.
Okay.
All right. Take care.